I've been having like financial problems, and I want to know if I'm going to be okay.
The money is coming, you know, because you need to get these divorce proceedings going so you can get some money from that Jacko. You hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Because the money is coming.
Okay.
You understand me?
Okay.
For many people in black communities, hoodoo didn't become feared overnight. It became feared gradually through politics, media, and social collapse. From the late 1970s into the early 1990s, the United States underwent a major ideological shift. The country moved sharply toward conservatism, and that shift reshaped how morality, crime, and culture were understood. This era begins with the Reagan administration. Reagan's political project reframed poverty as a personal failure rather than a systemic one. Drug use became a moral issue instead of a public health concern. Crime was no longer discussed as the outcome of economic policy, redlining, and disinvestment, but as a cultural flaw. These ideas did not exist in a vacuum. They landed hardest in black urban communities already destabilized by deindustrialization, unemployment, and shrinking public resources. As factories closed and wages disappeared, the narrative did not focus on economic abandonment. Instead, it focused on discipline, punishment, and control. This framing had consequences beyond policing and incarceration. It shaped how black life itself was interpreted. During the same period, conservative religious movements gained significant influence in American culture. Evangelical Christianity rose in political power, pushing a strict moral framework that divided the world into acceptable and unacceptable forms of belief. Anything outside of a narrow, white Christian norm was increasingly labeled as dangerous, deviant, or evil. African-derived spiritual practices, already misunderstood and racialized, were especially vulnerable to this framing. By the time George H.W. Bush entered office, the language of law and order had hardened into policy. The war on drugs expanded, police militarization increased, prison construction accelerated. Black communities were no longer just marginalized, they were openly criminalized. And when a community is criminalized, its culture is treated the same way. Music becomes suspect, dress becomes threatening, spiritual practices become evidence of moral decay. Hoodoo, once understood as folk practice, ancestral medicine, as survival knowledge, was increasingly lumped into the same category as crime, drugs, and disorder. This demonization was reinforced by a parallel cultural force, media. Throughout the 1980s, American film and television experienced a surge in horror narratives centered on cults, satanic ritual, and occult danger. African and Caribbean spiritual imagery was frequently used as visual shorthand for evil, chaos, and loss of control. These portrayals were not educational, they were sensational. And over time, repetition creates belief. As these images circulated, a broader phenomenon known as the satanic panic took hold across the country. Daycares were accused of ritual abuse, music was blamed for corruption, non-Christian spirituality was treated as a threat to social order. Although often discussed as a suburban or white evangelical phenomenon, its language and fear spread everywhere, including black neighborhoods. By the early 1990s, during the Clinton era, the demonization reached a new stage. Clinton's administration publicly distanced itself from overt racial language, but policy outcomes told a different story. 3 strikes laws, expanded sentencing, and mass incarceration disproportionately impacted black communities. At the same time, blackness itself was framed as a social problem to be managed. Within that environment, anything associated with black cultural autonomy, including spiritual traditions, was viewed with suspicion. Hoodoo did not disappear during this period. It went underground. It was no longer openly discussed as heritage or knowledge. Instead, it was whispered about as dangerous, cursed, or the devil. The shift was not the result of new spiritual realities. It was the result of political fear, economic collapse, and media conditioning converging at the same moment. Understanding that context matters, because without it, the demonization of hoodoo looks like superstition. With it, it looks like strategy. And this is only the beginning. In the next part, we examine how the satanic panic specifically entered black communities and why fear spread faster where stability had already been stripped away. By the early 1980s, fear was no longer just political, it became cultural. What historians now call the satanic panic did not begin in black communities. It emerged largely in white, suburban America through evangelical churches, talk shows, law enforcement seminars, and sensational news coverage. The premise was simple and terrifying, that secret satanic cults were operating everywhere, abusing children, corrupting families, and hiding in plain sight. There was little evidence, but there was constant repetition. Daycare workers were accused of ritual abuse. Heavy metal music was framed as a gateway to demonic influence. Books, games, and spiritual practices outside of mainstream Christianity were treated as threats to social order. The important point is this: panic does not stay contained. By the mid to late 1980s, the language of the satanic panic had moved beyond suburban spaces and into broader American culture, including black neighborhoods. This happened through several channels at once. First, churches. As conservative evangelical ideology gained national influence, black churches, already under pressure to present themselves as moral anchors amid social collapse, absorbed much of the same rhetoric. Spiritual authority became tied to distancing from anything labeled as occult, witchcraft, or root work. Not because those practices were suddenly new, but because association with them now carried social risk. In a moment when black communities were already being scrutinized, policed, and criminalized, respectability became a form of protection, and fear became a teaching tool. Second, schools and social institutions. During this period, anti-drug programs, moral education campaigns, and law enforcement outreach frequently included warnings about cults, Satanism, and spiritual danger. These messages were rarely nuanced. They did not distinguish between African-derived folk practices and fictional satanic narratives. To an institution, difference looks the same. Third, media saturation. Television specials, talk shows, and films repeatedly reinforced the same imagery: candles, symbols, rituals, and altered states portrayed as inherently dangerous. African and Caribbean spiritual aesthetics were routinely used as visual shorthand for chaos and evil. The result was a powerful association loop: spiritual imagery plus blackness plus poverty equaled danger. And over time, that association did not need to be explained. It was assumed. Inside black communities, this produced a specific kind of fear, not abstract, but practical. Parents warned children away from practices they did not fully understand. Elders discouraged questions out of concern for safety and social survival. Silence became a form of protection. What had once been ancestral knowledge was reframed as a liability. It's important to note that this shift did not come from new information about hoodoo itself. There was no sudden increase in harm, violence, or chaos tied to these practices. What changed was the environment around them. By the late 1980s, black communities were navigating economic devastation, aggressive policing, and moral scrutiny simultaneously. In that climate, anything that could attract suspicion, especially from the state or from dominant religious institutions, was pushed to the margins. Hoodoo became something people knew about but did not openly claim, something whispered about, something warned against, something framed as dangerous without explanation. This is how cultural memory gets distorted, not through force alone, but through fear led on fear. By the time the 1990s arrived, many people in black communities did not associate hoodoo with healing, protection, or survival. They associated it with curses, madness, and the devil. That association felt organic, but it was manufactured. And once fear is internalized, it does not need to be enforced from the outside.
By the mid-1980s, fear was no longer theoretical in black communities. It was material. Jobs were gone, public services were shrinking, entire neighborhoods were being hollowed out by disinvestment. At the same time, crack cocaine entered urban communities at an unprecedented scale. This was not simply a drug crisis. It was a structural collapse. Crack spread rapidly because conditions allowed it to. High unemployment, housing instability, aggressive policing paired with limited social support. Families were destabilized, trust eroded, daily life became unpredictable. In moments like this, communities search for explanations, not just policy explanations, but moral ones. Something had to account for the speed and severity of the destruction, and that search for meaning did not happen in a vacuum. By this point, black communities were already saturated with narratives about danger, deviance, and spiritual corruption. The language of the satanic panic was already present. The imagery from media was already familiar. So when chaos escalated, it did not take long for spiritual explanations to enter the conversation. Hoodoo, already misunderstood and increasingly hidden, became an easy target. Not because it caused harm, but because it existed outside institutional control. In times of crisis, informal systems are often blamed first. It is important to be precise here. There were individuals during this period who exploited desperation. Some used spiritual language irresponsibly. Some promised impossible outcomes. Some blurred the line between tradition and manipulation. That reality cannot be ignored. But exploitation is not the same thing as origin. To conflate the two is to misunderstand how collapse works. When systems fail, people reach for whatever tools they have left, spiritual, social, or otherwise. And wherever there's desperation, opportunists appear. The presence of exploitation does not invalidate the tradition itself. It reveals the conditions surrounding it. During the crack epidemic, mainstream institutions did not offer healing. They offered punishment. Healthcare was scarce. Rehabilitation was inaccessible. Policing intensified. Spiritual frameworks, formal and informal, filled the gap. But unlike churches, hoodoo had no institutional protection, no centralized authority, no public defense. It existed in fragments, kitchens, back rooms, whispers, warnings, and fragments are easy to distort. As addiction, violence, and incarceration spread, cause and correlation collapsed into one another. People began to associate misfortune with practices they did not fully understand. Bad outcomes demanded explanations. Fear demanded an object. Hoodoo became that object. This is how scapegoating functions. It does not require proof. It requires proximity to pain. Over time, stories hardened into belief. Belief hardened into warning. Warning hardened into taboo. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, many people in black communities did not reject hoodoo because they studied it and found it harmful. They rejected it because they associated it with everything that was going wrong around them. Addiction, loss, violence, mental strain. Those associations felt real, but they were not causal. They were contextual. When a community is under siege, nuance disappears. Everything becomes either safe or dangerous, acceptable or forbidden. And hoodoo, already pushed to the margins, fell on the forbidden side. This did not mean the tradition vanished. It meant it became distorted, detached from ethics, detached from lineage, detached from explanation. What survived was not understanding, but fear. And fear, once internalized, does more damage than any external enemy. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, fear no longer needed explanation. It had an image. Media did what policy and panic could not do alone. It gave fear a face. American film and television during this period experienced a sharp increase in stories centered on cults, satanic ritual, possession, and spiritual danger. These narratives rarely distinguished between different spiritual traditions. Instead, they relied on visual shorthand, candles, symbols, chants, accents, dark rooms, altered states. African and Caribbean spiritual imagery became especially useful to these stories, not because it was accurate, but because it already sat outside mainstream understanding. Hoodoo, Vodou, Santeria, and other African-derived traditions were flattened into a single aesthetic, mysterious, dangerous, and out of control. This mattered because images reach places facts cannot. For many people, especially those without access to historical or cultural education, media became the primary teacher. Repeated often enough, fiction feels like documentation. At the same time, American culture became obsessed with the idea of secret knowledge, secret cults, underground rituals, people pretending to have access to unseen power. This obsession created a paradox. On one hand, spiritual practices were demonized. On the other, they were commodified. Nowhere is this more visible than in the rise of televised psychics and pop spiritual figures during the 1990s. Figures like Miss Cleo entered mainstream consciousness not as cultural educators, but as entertainment. Her character drew heavily on Caribbean spiritual stereotypes, accent, confidence, mystical authority, presented without context or lineage. For some viewers, she represented empowerment. For others, she confirmed long-held fears. The nuance was lost either way. What mattered was the message. This kind of spirituality was theatrical, deceptive, or dangerous. This was not limited to Miss Cleo. Books, talk shows, hotline psychics, and late-night television consistently portrayed non-Christian spirituality as either fraudulent or evil, sometimes both at once. In black communities already navigating economic hardship and social scrutiny, these portrayals landed with particular force. They reinforced the idea that spiritual practices outside the church were either scams or gateways to harm. And because these images came through television, often framed as news, documentaries, or true stories, they carried authority. The line between entertainment and education blurred. Horror films deepened this effect. During the same period, countless movies used African-inspired spiritual imagery as visual shorthand for chaos, possession, or moral collapse. These films did not need to name hoodoo specifically. The imagery did the work. Over time, these visuals merged with existing fears from the satanic panic and the lived trauma of the crack epidemic. What emerged was a closed loop. Fear produced images. Images reinforced belief. Belief hardened into silence. Inside black communities, this created a generational shift. Younger people grew up knowing hoodoo only as something associated with danger or deception. Elders discouraged discussion, not out of ignorance, but from protection. In a world where black life was already over-policed and over-scrutinized, spiritual difference felt like risk, so culture adjusted. What was once ancestral knowledge became folklore. What was once practiced became rumor. What was once understood became feared. This was not accidental. Media does not merely reflect reality, it organizes it. By the end of the 1990s, hoodoo was no longer widely recognized as cultural technology or survival knowledge. It was recognized as an image, and images, once internalized, are difficult to unlearn. By the late 1990s, the demonization of hoodoo no longer needed outside enforcement. It had been internalized. Fear does not have to be imposed forever. Once absorbed, it maintains itself. Inside many black communities, hoodoo is no longer openly discussed as heritage, medicine, or survival knowledge. It was referenced indirectly through warnings, jokes, or half-remembered stories. Don't play with that. That's not something you mess with. That's the devil. These statements were rarely followed by explanation, not because people lacked intelligence, but because the original context had been stripped away. This is how cultural erasure works in practice, not through sudden disappearance, but through distortion. Over time, hoodoo became disconnected from its historical function. It was no longer understood as a system shaped by enslavement, segregation, and survival. It became associated instead with chaos, manipulation, or danger. That shift did not occur because hoodoo fundamentally changed. It occurred because the environment around it did. Political fear, economic collapse, media imagery, religious pressure. Together, they created a framework where black autonomy, spiritual or otherwise, was treated as suspicious. And once suspicion becomes normalized, silence follows. This silence had consequences. Without open discussion, ethical frameworks weakened. Lineage knowledge was lost. Distinction between tradition and exploitation blurred. What survived in public memory was not hoodoo as it was practiced, but hoodoo as it was feared. At the same time, the broader culture began selectively consuming fragments of African-derived spirituality, symbols without history, aesthetics without accountability, power without responsibility. What was once demonized became marketable, just not on black terms. This contradiction is important. Hoodoo was never inherently good or evil. It was never a monolith. It was a tool set shaped by conditions. Like any system of knowledge, it could be used responsibly or irresponsibly. That reality does not invalidate it. It humanizes it. The problem was never that black communities questioned hoodoo. The problem was that they were never given the full context to question it honestly. Fear replaced education. Warnings replaced history. Silence replaced study. Reclaiming hoodoo does not mean romanticizing the past. It does not mean pretending harm never occurred. It does not mean ignoring exploitation or misuse. It means restoring context. It means understanding how power, policy, and perception shaped what we were taught to fear. It means separating ancestral knowledge from the chaos that surrounded it. Most importantly, it means giving people the information to decide for themselves. That is the purpose of this work. Not conversion, not persuasion, documentation. This is why Hoodoo for the Hood too ain't nothing but the devil was written. Not as a spell book, not as spectacle, but as a record of how hoodoo was reframed, misrepresented, and pushed into the shadows. A record of how fear replaced understanding. A record of what was lost and what can be reclaimed with clarity. If this series raised questions for you, that is intentional. Questions are how memory returns. The book is not the conclusion. It is the context that was missing. Read it, study it, then decide for yourself. That is the work.